Okay, guys, this is going to be chapter 16, video 2. So in video 1, we just started to talk about how different populations can change. We talked about genetic drift, genetic equilibrium. Now we're really going to start to talk about how do we get from one common ancestor, one founding population, to different species. Okay, and that concept is called speciation. It's the idea that we start with one gene pool, changes happen within that gene pool, and then we end up with completely different species that then can't interbreed. Okay, remember that word interbreed. That means two different gene pools trying to breed together. It's a word that we don't talk about as a vocabulary word, but it's one that throws a lot of people off when we're talking through these concepts. Okay, so right here is your definition for speciation. This first picture here, you guys, shows one founding population or common ancestor in this first pig. And then the star here represents maybe a mutation, some type of division in your gene pool. And we end up with one gene pool over here, which eventually evolves into its own species, and another gene pool here that evolves into its own species. Okay. So first, in order for speciation to happen, we have to have what we call reproductive isolation. We have to take one gene pool and we have to break it into more than one. Maybe it's 2 gene pools, maybe it's 4, but we have to isolate these different gene pools so they can't breed with each other. So if you get a mutation in one gene pool, it stays in that one gene pool so that it can evolve into a new species. And there's 3 types of that. The very first one is called behavioral isolation. This is where, for some reason, one part of a gene pool starts to have different breeding behaviors. And as they start to have different breeding behaviors, they may end up off in their own gene pool, breeding only with each other. Think sounds that birds make. In class, we watched a video, or we will watch a video about birds of paradise and mating rituals. Okay, so if you are not in class and you haven't seen that, go ahead and take a peek at it. You've got all these different species living in the same place, and they can't breed with each other, not only because they've become new species now, but also because they show different mating behaviors. The second one is geographic isolation. This is where you've got one common gene pool, and it gets split up into 2 or more gene pools by actual physical barriers. This picture right here, you guys can see we have our initial group of bugs, and we've got some dark brown bugs and light brown bugs, and then something happens where they're cut off from each other, and now we have 2 gene pools that can't interbreed with each other. Think of this like a river. Okay, we had a river that made its way through all of a sudden through our environment, and now we have 2 separate populations, and they're going to evolve separately from each other because they can't breed with each other. In this population, you can see that some type of mutation for green bugs popped up, and that maybe made them more fit in their environment. But because this group at the bottom can't breed with the group that got the green mutation, we're not going to see any green bugs in this one. So over time, these 2 populations, they're going to continue to evolve apart from each other. And as you keep seeing more and more and more genetic change, the DNA in this group of green bugs will be so different from the group of these brown bugs that now we'll be able to consider them 2 different species. So here you can see when that geographic barrier is taken away, now these 2 species can't breed with each other. They're just too different. The last type of the last type of reproductive isolation is called temporal isolation, and that means that 1 or more species breed at a different time. So at one point in time, you may have had a common ancestor of these frogs. So we've got 4 types of frogs here. Maybe you had one type of common ancestor that bred sort of in the middle here in the May-June time. But over time, this species right here, the wood frog, started to breed earlier and earlier and earlier until it was off in its own gene pool, okay, off in its own population breeding, and wasn't able to breed with the others. Okay, so these are the 3 ways, the 3 mechanisms for evolution, okay? Behavioral isolation, geographic isolation, and temporal isolation. So we can't have evolution happen until we get more than one gene pool. Okay. Now let's talk about steps to speciation. I'm going to run through these really quick because you're going to see these a lot more in detail in class. So first we have to have our founding population arrive, or our original gene pool. Somehow they are separated from each other. Then when they are separated, either genetic variability, which we get from gene shuffling and crossing over when we're making sperm and egg cells, either the genetic variability that's already in that population or new mutations can pop up that can start to cause changes in those 2 gene pools. Then within each of those gene pools that are now evolving in their own ways, in their own places, we start to see natural selection. So in one gene pool, let's go back to those bugs we were talking about. In one gene pool, the green trait, that mutation that popped up, that became the most fit. So those were chosen for. Though I mean, those traits were chosen. And then the other population, we didn't have that trait pop up. So whichever one of those are the most fit. Then whoever has the best adaptations gets to reproduce. Obviously, if you've got a certain mutation that made you more fit, that one's going to be passed down. As that reproduction happens, we start to see more and more change in a species, and eventually we get two different species. They evolve apart. Now they're reproductively isolated because they can't breed with each other. They're two completely new species. Okay, and we've gone through the process of speciation. Okay, there are three different graphs that we can use to represent how species change. The first is directional selection. This is where we take our average, and one direction or the other becomes more average in the population. This would be if all of a sudden it were more beneficial for if we had like an average sized grizzly bear were surviving, and all of a sudden it became more beneficial for the larger grizzly bears. Okay? You get a sort of a narrowing of the population. Okay, you start to the smaller ones are selected against, so those are the ones who die. Stabilizing selection, everybody gets more average. Okay, everybody gets more average. Think maybe this would be like fish, like salmon. I'm just thinking of that because I talked about grizzly bears, and they eat salmon. Maybe average size salmon become more and more and more fit, and the larger salmon don't survive in the population, and the smaller salmon don't survive. So we get more and more and more average. That's stabilizing selection. And the last one is disruptive selection. This is where you have two traits that are selected for, and the average is not the best adaptation. The average is actually the worst adaptation. Okay, think of this like your moths. In your peppered moths, we had two completely different colors. We had white and black, and those that lived on the white trees survived, and if there were some black trees, those ones survived. But average, like if we had like a mixture of the two, if we'd had like a gray moth, those would not survive. If you look at human height, we may have already looked at this in class. If we did already, you've seen it. If you were not here, check it out now. Okay, you guys can see this is all the heights from all of our biology classes this year. And you can see that most of us fit into this bell curve. Okay, most of us fit into that average in the middle. It doesn't mean we don't have short and tall people. It's just that it's not as frequent in the population. Okay, you guys, that is it for Chapter 16, Video 2. Thank you very much.